Hi, this is O'Connor, and thank you for joining this webinar. And this is all about supply chain transparency, sustainability, and compliance in a post-COVID-19 world. And it has a relationship to accounting, reporting, finance, and many disciplines. It's just that we are applying it to the supply chain because of COVID. We understood that there was a lot of stress put on global supply chains around the world. And at the end of the day, we want to understand more about how that has impacted transparency, sustainability, and compliance. Now, as I go through this webinar, I want to give an initial understanding of the setting of what happened in terms of the panic buying, the supply of PPE, demand for PPE, the bottlenecks in the supply chain, and then the long-term impacts of the trade war and COVID-19. Now, within that setting, I want to talk about research opportunities for supply chain transparency, sustainability, and compliance. Now, we all know that there was panic buying going on. The supply of PPE, it was cowboy land at that time because there was a lot of middlemen buying out capacity in factories back in March, back in January, February, March, April in 2020, and governments were trying to go direct to the factory, but realising that factories already received money to commit capacity to various middle players who were making the fast buck, selling at a margin to the government officials around the world. We understood there was a lot of problems and issues with that because there was little attention paid to the quality of the masks that were being delivered, and we found that out when the EU and different government bodies started complaining and finding batches of poor quality masks. There was 28 factories that entered the PPE sector. Like normally that was half that amount was normally in that sector, but it just doubled overnight. Literally, the daily production of ordinary masks soared for 10 million daily in February to 116 million per day 4 weeks later. So it was amazing how everything could ramp up when there's a almighty dollar being put down for factory capacity. Like I have my personal experience of buying the N95 mask, like that was the cream of the cream masks, for 119 ringgit for a box of 20 in September 2019. Just over 6 months later, they were selling for 300 ringgit. So it's really, really interesting. And, you know, buyers from overseas, by the time we got to March or April, when they were really desperate for masks, had to decide quickly. Like, you had to put money down. You couldn't just promise that you'll pay after delivery. You had to put the money down first and trust that delivery would come after that. Material prices were going up, FOB prices increased over 4 times. There was a lot of middleman problems, and as I said earlier, there was a lot of challenges with quality, and so this all led to bottlenecks in the supply chain. Like in initial stages in February, it was the raw materials and the labor that was challenging. The bloat mold, which is the core element of a mask, where you got one big giant roll that could make 700,000 masks, and that was in limited supply. There was the limited supply of labor because China was actually locked down for over a month, and then people couldn't go into factories, so factories couldn't operate. And even when factories went to ramp up at the end of February into March, they couldn't get all of their key productive people because some were still stuck in various provinces around China. Then we went into March and we found we had bottlenecks in the area of air freight. Why? Because Western countries around the world were starting to close down airports and stop the actual passengers from arriving from other countries. And as we know, half of the freight around the world is in the belly of passenger aircraft. And then we've got into April, where air freight, the price of air freight has just risen so quickly, and then there was even more regulations on the 10th of April, where all exports of PPE were likely to be inspected by customs before they go out of China, and that actually slowed down even more the shipment of PPE out of China. Now, what is really interesting is that for Chinese factories, the trade war imposed a lot of costs, especially for those shipping to the USA. And COVID-19 imposed a lot of challenges with regard to labour and logistics. And so initially there was a lot of uncertainty because of importers, brands, multinationals. And the uncertainty for the SMEs was that they really had to think about, do we change country? Do we move from China to Vietnam, China to Mexico, like what GoPro did, or China to Malaysia, like a Romba vacuum cleaner did? These were big decisions that SMEs had to make very, very quickly, regardless, even before COVID-19. But for the multinationals, it was more likely a change of how much percentage they move from China and stay a little bit in China. Other countries up for grabs for taking in move factories with Vietnam, India, Taiwan, Malaysia. But for the multinationals, a bigger picture come into play, because really you don't move for one factor alone. There are other factors like IP, protection, transparency of the supply chain, especially when it comes to the human rights and environmental social responsibility of the supply chain, which multinationals carry a lot of reputation risk associated. Then there was the labour and skill, the ecosystem disruption. So it's very important that there's more likely multinationals will stay on one factor alone. And more importantly, it was more important to, if we're going to stay in China, we want to consolidate the supply base, focusing on getting more transparency at the second tier level, and bring in virtual design teams, that is, try and get design not over the email, but actually design by moving design teams to the factory, and have a much stronger collaboration partnership with the suppliers. But generally, this move out of China has been kickstarted by the trade war and is actually exacerbated by COVID-19, meaning that there was some countries that were much more transparent and accessible than China, and so it's even more important that we had some new factories or new sources in the supply chain closer to the market. So for example, Mexico is close to the USA market and was subject to lesser restrictions in terms of imports in the USA compared to those coming from China, or the factories had less restrictions as a result of COVID and the labour availability. So there's a lot of issues going on in terms of COVID-19 and in terms of the trade war that had made the supply chain, or global supply chain around the world, subject to greater scrutiny in terms of, well, we need to have more transparency. Number two, we need to have a little bit more resilience in our supply chain. In other words, we need to, the supply chain, if we locate it in a country, it needs to be sustainable. It cannot just be closed down because of some black swan event. So there needs to be some more sense of sustainability of working with suppliers in the long term. And also then there's supply chain compliance. Increasingly, Western governments, USA, EU, are putting stricter regulations on the import of goods from developing countries. And so I want to talk about these issues of transparency, sustainability, and compliance as it pertains to supply chains in the post-COVID-19 world. So there's some sense that we could have a top 10 and think about all these issues and these trends, and I've noticed I'm looking at transparency, I'm looking at sustainability, looking at compliance, and really under supplier management, the consolidation of the supply trend started occurring before the trade war. Greater attention to second and third tier suppliers have started to occur, and it's even more important now, so we want greater transparency in that area. And increasingly we want digitization of the supplier management will accelerate. Why? Because we cannot fly people into the factory when a country is closed down. So supply chain transparency in these issues is really, really critical. Then we can talk about sustainability, where it's very important that we try and improve how a factory becomes more efficient over time, and you just cannot assume that a factory can continue to supply you when you're under market pressure to deliver better product for the same price, or the same product for a cheaper price. You're going to put pressure on a factory, and if it doesn't improve its productivity or figure out ways to become more efficient, then that factory is not going to be sustainable. So I'm talking about research in that area. Then finally, we've got compliance, which is number 9 here. There's greater attention will be given to certification and compliance of factories in some developing countries. Factories in China will actually consolidate in order to manage the increased regulation and compliance costs. Compliance costs could be something as simple as requiring more extensive lab testing of products that are actually manufactured in a factory. And at the moment, there's a lot of lab testing required if you want to sell on Amazon in the USA, if you want to sell in the EU. Lab testing for ROHS, lab testing for REACH, lab testing for various other requirements, especially under FDA, if your product has food, if your product is silicon, if your product has a certain material inside, then you need a lab test to make sure it doesn't go over the limits. So lab tests are very, very critical in the compliance area. And so EU regulations, requirements for Amazon in selling in the USA also require, and these demands will come back to the factory in the end, and will create more costs for the factory. So what does that mean for research, and what are some of the pathways that we can follow in research in these areas? So I'll just very quickly talk about supply chain transparency, the sustainability and compliance. So under the transparency, a big area I want you to be aware of is that even before COVID or even the trade war, Pivot 88 was a major player in actually making visible the actual factory in another country to senior management in the home country of the multinational, without management having to visit the factory. And they did that through a series of tablets that Pivot 88 would supply the factory as part of the contract, paid for by the factory or the vendor or the customer. And then the factory was required to actually update various quality gates as the customer's product went through the production. And so updating that tablet was Pivot 88's system that the client or the vendor at the other end could access at any time on any day of the week. And so the vendor or the clients that engaged Pivot 88 as the service provider to digitize the actual ongoings of the factory on a daily basis, then they got the benefit of having visibility on a day-to-day basis of what was going on in the factory. And they've been very successful, especially in the apparel industry. And now Pivot 88 has lots and lots of factories under their monitoring, and they just have thousands of clients that have actually benefited from this system that they are using. Essentially, they are providing more visibility of the client's product as it goes through various assembly and quality gates in the factory. And so this is the Pivot 88's system under supply chain transparency. This is a very interesting area of research to think about those clients that have engaged Pivot 88. How do they see the supply chain differently? And do they see this as a complete substitute for sending people to the factory post COVID-19, like in the future when countries are not subject to border restrictions? Will they send design teams? Will they send their middle management to the factory as often now that this system is in place. So these are interesting questions that we can ask on the transparency side. Now, another thing on the transparency is the problems that multinationals, even SMEs overseas, have had in monitoring suppliers. And research that I've done on supplier blacklist data, like between 2012 and 2017, we had over 1,500 complaints that we analysed, and we segregated them into, and about 75% of those complaints were actual scams where you got a product that wasn't working, but you weren't able to contact the supplier afterwards, or you didn't receive anything at all and you lost part of your money. And so what we wanted to understand is that for those SMEs and multinationals, if they had certain controls in place, was the incidence of this outright fraudulent behaviour by the supplier significantly lower? And what we find is that is the case when they used third-party inspectors, when they used buyer visits, when they used contracts and so forth. And just talking a little bit about the blacklist, we can see that out of those 1,200 sample here, you found that the initial order, there was a complaint out of 70. It happened at 70% of the time of the initial order, 18% of the reorder. In terms of experience, there's a whole range of experience, and there's a whole range of countries. And I'm just showing the China suppliers here, but we had complaints of suppliers in other countries all around the world. So it wasn't just China that was subject to complaints. There was various other information that we got from the blacklist data, where there's 77% had contracts, 83% did not visit the factory, 58% did not have independent QC, 85% said that the information on the business license was not accurate. And so, there were these hints that you were going to run into trouble if you didn't have a QC, you didn't visit the factory, you didn't have a contract, or there was something suspect about the business license of the supplier. And so what we found was, in trying to predict the incidence of a fraudulent scam over an ordinary complaint where you just got poor quality, but the supplier ended up following up with you even if it was slow or something like that, what we found is that for those buyers that have a verified business activity check in place, or a visit, or a third-party quality check, or contracts, then the incidence of an outright fraud where you lost your money, where you got a poor quality product or not, was significantly lower. So that's an example of what we mean by supply chain transparency. So there was these instruments that we can use to increase the transparency of the supply chain. Pivot 88 is probably something that is going to replace a lot of visits in the future. But will it replace everything? Probably not. You will still have third-party visits in the future. You still have third-party quality checks. And so now, under the area of supply chain sustainability, I'm analysing factory audits. Like, we've got over 500 factory audits that were undertaken in the last 6 or 7 years by a major third-party auditor. Got access to this data and research I'm working on at the moment. This is what a factory audit report looks like. Now, this is an audit of a factory, not an audit of the product that is being made for a client. This is an audit to establish whether the factory has the capability to make what the client wants the factory to make, or has the capability to support the promise that the supplier is giving to the customer. And we have looked at over 500 of these factory audits and find that it's very, very interesting when we spread out where the audits were taking place, that in some provinces in China, like in Shaanxi or Hubei or Guangxi, the quality of the factory audit, like in terms of the general quality, the environment, the maintenance and general assembly quality, is very, very low. But if we go to Shanghai, Guangdong or Jiangxi, the quality is much higher. And so it's really interesting that not all factories are the same. And what we already, there's just initial data that I've looked at with these factory audits just to understand that, okay, not every province is the same in a developing country. Factories closer to the eastern seaboard are likely to have much higher quality in their promise to customers for the products that they want to buy. And so here we have from the lowest, whereas Zhejiang, to the highest, which is Jiangxi province, and you can see not all factories are the same. And as we go inland, some of the quality of the factory audits is much lower than those closer to the eastern seaboard, as shown by Jiangxi, Guangzhou, etc. Okay, so what else are we doing in the area of supply chain sustainability? Well, we're looking at product audits. And what do we mean by product audits? This is where you have decided to source from a supplier, and then you've put down 30% or 40%, and then you've asked the supplier to make 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 or 10,000 units of your product. And so it's important before that product is shipped or put on the ship and sent to your country that a third-party inspector comes in to check how much of that batch that was manufactured meets the standard of the customer. And so we talk about the standard in terms of AQL limits. We've got minor defect, where you want less than 2.5% of that occurring. For a 4%, you want less than 4% of a sample of that occurring. For a major defect, you want less than 2.5% of that sample occurring. And so there's different ways of setting out how big should the sample be, depending on whether you want a standard 1 audit, standard 2 audit, or a standard 3 level audit. And so what we're looking at these product audits is we want to understand that if the product audits come from the factories in Zhejiang or Shaanxi or Fujian or Hubei, where the factory audit quality is very low, do they also have product audit quality that is also low? Or the factory audits that have come from Guangdong, Jiangxi, Hubei, Shandong, which is very, very high in terms of the factory audit, do they also produce high product quality audits? So we just want to know whether the factory audit leads to a better quality audit. Remember, when we looked at the Blacklist data, not all of the buyers that order from a supplier get a factory audit undertaken. And even this vendor that I've got access to data, in total the vendor has undertaken about 550 factory audits, but over an 8 or 9 year period they've also undertaken 12,500 product audits. So there's a big difference between how often buyers around the world ask for a factory audit compared to a product audit. And so we want to know if is there some correspondence between getting a good factory audit outcome and having a good product audit outcome. And this is all about sustainability. Also, do factories learn from that factory audit to make their product audit better? And so we've got this framework here where we try and understand that if our dependent variable or objective function is to have a higher AQL, that's a higher pass rate of acceptable quality limits of whatever product the factory is making, how much of that outcome is due to the fact that the factory went through an audit previously, number one, that there was a prior product inspection of a prior product run through that factory undertaken, so then they're learning from the prior one, or how much is it due to the factory size or the location or the order size, or where the customer comes from, whether the customer comes from Asia or from Europe or from USA, how demanding the customer is. So we're trying to understand the determinants that make some factories better than others in creating a better quality outcome. And in some ways you would think, if we didn't know that the initial factory audit, it's very hard to understand the AQL outcome is a result of the poor factory or other results. But now we can, because we are matching the factory audit with the product audit, and that's something interesting that we're doing here to understand more about supply chain sustainability, because ultimately sustainability is not just about not polluting the environment. It's not just about underage labour, but sustainability is all about reducing waste. It's all about having efficient operations, so you don't overuse labour, that you don't overuse electricity, you don't overuse resources. You actually save, you cut down on the demand for resources rather than just trying to cut down the byproduct of the production associated with pollution. Okay, so we want to have a broader view of what we mean by sustainability, and this is one project that we're trying to contribute here. Now, the other final part I want to talk about very, very quickly is supply chain compliance, and a lot of this is driven first and foremost by EU regulation, because if you make a product, even something simple like a pen, and you ship it to Europe, and in any one of the EU states where there's a recall of this product because it doesn't work for some reason, then that goes up onto a website, and immediately that same product has to be recalled from every member of the EU. So these are very, very strict standards, and what they have is this RAPEX system where there's a rapid alert system that there's hardly any delay. If something goes wrong in one country, within 24 hours there is a product recall right throughout the EU. And so this is a very, very strict regime that you need to think. If you are importing into the EU and increasingly into the US, you as a importer of record need to be very, very vigilant on the quality of your product that you are shipping into that country. It is not the responsibility of the factory, it's actually the responsibility of you, the importer of the record, to make sure that the factory is giving you good quality products. And so we're interested in understanding the extent to which, or the degree of awareness that importers of records have, like importers into EU has, of these requirements. And there's one third-party company that helps to document the extent of this awareness, and that is Product IP. Like, this is a bit more of the rapid alert system, an example here of a bike not working, and then suddenly it goes up, and therefore it has to be recalled from every country in the EU. And same for face masks, and you can go online and actually check out all of the problems that have occurred, or all of the issues of recalls that have been made, and this is publicly available. So what we're trying to think about is we could try and get back to understand to what extent do importers of record have awareness of this rapid alert system, to the extent that they want to make sure that they are in compliance with the EU laws or with US laws or other country laws. And what Product IP does, and that's a company that you pay them and they tell you, okay, you're importing this product like spectacles into the EU, then you need to comply in terms of this documentation, this one, and this one. And it's up to the importer of record to decide which documentations they want to comply with. Product IP is just suggesting to them, this is the records that you need to keep, and they will keep the records for you. but it's the decision of the importer record how many of these records they want to fill out and register. And so product IP have a range of records. They have a range of clients. They have thousands of clients keeping the records, ranging from 10% compliance with all the documentation that should be required, right, from over to 90% or 100%. So there's some of their clients have documented everything that is required as importer of record, but a lot of their clients have only documented 10% or 20% of the regulations that are required. Like, they'll get caught out one day, but there's always that 1% of event that happens that they'll have to pay big money if they do get caught out. Not everyone is complying at 100%. And so what we want to try and understand with product IP is to what extent what is driving some of these clients of product IP, the importers of record, to comply more than others. Is it because of their experience with importing into the EU? Is it the number of inspections that they have had given with their factory? Is the amount of social compliance they've required with the factory, or other communication that is associated with their reputation in the market, how strong their brand is, because they don't want to destroy their brand value from having one less document that they need to have. So there's all these issues that could cause some importers of record to have more documentation than others, and that's one proposal that we're thinking about in terms of supply chain compliance. So another area is actually to go back to the factory and to think about PPE and to talk to suppliers that are in the PPE industry, personal protection equipment industry, to understand the challenges that they have had in actually making their product to comply not only with Chinese laws but with overseas country laws that have been dictated to by their customers, and to understand to what extent have they complied with these challenges, how fast has it changed the way they actually make their product, or has it changed the way that where they focused the sale of their product? Are they selling just to countries that have less regulations than other countries, for example? So trying to understand how compliance laws or regulations around the world affect the behavior of importers of record, and number two, how they compliance and regulations affect the behavior of factories. And so together, I'm interested in supply chain transparency. Even when companies are allowed to send their management to the factories to get full visibility of what's going on, will they do it to the same extent as they did before 2020, before COVID? Or will they pull back and actually rely more on digitalization of the factory operations? And to what extent will that be dependent on the strength of the relationship with the supplier, and also which country the supplier is in? Or sustainability, to what extent can factories improve their operations as a result of this continual audit process? Does the factory audit help them be better prepared to do better product audits? Because ultimately, if they have better AQL levels on the product audit, there's going to be less wastage and less environmental pollution and resource usage than if they're not meeting the AQL levels. And finally, compliance. I'm interested in how regulations around the world are changing the behavior of importers of record, and number two, changing the behavior of factories, which are the original assembler of products that are imported into EU, into the US and other Western developed countries. So that's what we're talking about. That's the research I'm doing in this area. Happy to take questions, and thank you for listening, and catch you in the next section. Bye for now.